you. So Crystal and I are glad to be here. We've been glad to have been asked to participate in this workshop to share our practical experience with determining the quality of alternative data that we use to both improve and augment price statistics here at BLS. We use the term alternative data throughout our presentation, and what we mean by that is just simply data that we don't collect with existing PPI or CPI processes and procedures. There's a lot of alternative data incorporated in the PPI and the CPI because we cover the whole economy, so we have a lot of data that we have looked at and used. A few examples, we've used Department of Transportation data, CMS data, as Steve mentioned this morning, as those are administrative and publicly available data. As far as purchase data sets, we've looked at and used Nielsen and J.D. Power, huge data sets. We also have companies that extract data from their databases and provide us a data set from their company. And also, if and only if a company gives us permission, we have also web scraped data and we have accessed data through their API. So these are the types of things we're talking about when we talk about alternative data in our presentation. The focus of this morning's session is, we know, administrative data, but our quality metrics and our fitness for use determinations are very similar across all the types of data that I've just mentioned. So we wanted to just, our quality metrics do indeed apply to all of them, but particularly to administrative data, so it's relevant for this morning's topic. To give you a little sense of history on the alternative data use of both of our programs, PPI has used non-survey, publicly available data, for example, for agricultural products, since virtually its beginnings as a judgmentally selected commodity sample. Granted, it was obtained through paper publications, and now we've moved to electronics. CPI has used alternative data for a very long time as well. In the 80s, when it became more electronically available, they advanced their efforts, and they have been investigating additional sources ever since then. So Bob Groves mentioned that quality assessment is dependent on the use of the data. So I thought I'd go over some of the uses that the PPI and the CPI, how we use the alternative data. What do we use it for? First, it's to create sample frames. CPI uses typically a dedicated outlet survey for most of the outlets. But for certain CPI categories, the dedicated frame is not as cheap or as good as frames created from alternative sources. For example, they draw their sample for used cars from J.D. Power data. The PPI tends to obtain sampling frames more for the service industries, where employment, that's included in our free frame that we use for BLS, the unemployment insurance file. That's what we usually use for our sampling frame. When employment's not a very good measure of size for sampling, we tend to obtain other sampling frames. Also, benchmarking is used to analyze the sample and improve sampling and collection processes and tools and existing methodologies. It helps us answer questions: do we have representative samples? How does our sample distributions compare to the secondary source? And then when indexes are able to be calculated with the secondary source, how do they compare to our data as well? We also use alternative frames when our sample is too small to support hedonic quality adjustment models. And then in an effort to minimize confusion, PPI has also used alternative data to estimate a current month price. For example, if the respondent is late in reporting. And then for CPI, they've used Department of Energy information to pre-select consumption amounts to price too. On occasion, we use it as a quality check in the PPI. We verify the reports that come in from our current respondents. We just use it as a quality check. We look at alternative data and just to validate what we're getting is correct. The conference organizers asked us to specifically address these dimensions, and we'll go into detail about them. We added reliability because it's important to us, but cost we specifically added because it's so important, and full costs need to be carefully considered, especially considering our budget and resource constraints that we might face. The first quality dimension is accuracy. Accuracy considerations are going to be covered over the next 2 or 3 slides, and this dimension is actually very important to us. It's the hardest one to measure, and it's the one we most examine when considering whether to use an alternative data source. More generally, all of these accuracy considerations that I'm going to talk about answer the question of whether the data can be used even with adjustments or compromises in PPI or CPI, given our measurement objectives and our constructs. The accuracy considerations get at data quality. The first one is transparency, and there's 3 facets of transparency. First, the transparency of the actual alternative data. Could it have unknown quality? Could it have unknown estimation techniques? What if we don't understand all the estimation techniques underlying the data? Are there unknown biases in the data? And we always look for if the source includes quality statistics that we can hang our hats on. So, second is the transparency of both the PPI and the CPI. If we use an alternative source and we divulge that alternative source, will the CPI and the PPI, both indicators that move or influence markets, will they be predictable before we release them? And what are the implications of that? And then third, and very importantly, we need to protect the data and the source so that respondent information is not divulged. We cannot divulge who responds to our survey, who's in our survey. So we have to protect that as well. Okay, the next is, are we getting a sample or a universe? We have been able to obtain data sets. I have one example for municipal bonds in the investment banking index. There's hundreds of thousands of transactions for municipal bonds. We had a survey, a representative survey, but our respondents were complaining that it was a burden on them to price our municipal bonds, their municipal bond transactions. So we were able to obtain a universe file, and the methodology matched enough so that we could incorporate it into our indexes, relieve that respondent burden, and those investment bankers could report on other things we were asking them to give us. So, but if we do have a sample in the alternative data and it's not a universe, how good is it? We need to know how good it is. What do we know about the sampling procedures, the response rates, and is there any non-response bias in the data? Is there a way to measure the error when we get samples as alternative data? We also worry that BLS no longer has control over the quality of the input data. We had an example one time where the programming in one data source wasn't correct, and the data they sent us was indeed wrong. So we have to catch that kind of thing in the data as well. And then lastly, I mentioned concordance here. I know it's in another workshop, but the mapping of alternative data items into both our structures can be difficult, if not impossible. It is labor-intensive, and it's ongoing. So the implications for incorporating the data into the current methodology are great, and then we proceed, with caution in integration. That's a different workshop, but I won't talk about that. The next facet of data accuracy I want to talk about is coverage error. We want to make sure we don't have coverage error. The first facet of that is time. We need years of data to establish the acceptability of the source. We produce also monthly indexes. We need monthly data sometimes, depending on what we're going to use the data for. So usage becomes very important there. We need geographic coverage. CPI produces indexes at the PSU level. It's geographic areas that are more specific than region. And then PPI produces statistics at the national level. So we have used analysis of variance to determine if geographic area is a significant factor in price movement. And that was together in the CPI, maybe together to gauge whether they could use a national statistics or national data to represent these regions. We have to look at outlet coverage. Let me just give you an example. For instance, we looked at alternative data for the food at home category in the CPI, and Nielsen only included grocery stores, drug stores, and some warehouses, but there weren't convenience stores or gas stations included. And that could be important for snacks and soft drinks if the price change is different in those types of outlets. So as far as establishments, if What if an establishment that we expect is not participating with data aggregators from our alternative source? It could be a major share of the market. It's not reflected in the purchased or the administrative data. So we have non-response bias concerns there. In addition, and this seems very straightforward, but alternative data sources must be checked to eliminate establishments that are not in scope of the survey. For example, only domestic producers are included in the PPI. So some data elements have to be there so that we can get out the non-domestic producers. And then item coverage. Some data sources may be a really small segment of what we collect, and that tends to be the case in a lot of cases. We find alternative data, but it's very, very little item coverage compared to the scope of what we have to cover. And finally, data quality at the item level, probably the most important thing. I want to talk about price level of detail first. What types of data are included in the data? First, at the top, is it consumer data or producer data? I recently got access to a data set, and when I looked at it, it was for the producer price index. We thought, well, it was consumer prices, so we passed it along. The next thing is whether list prices are included or transaction prices. We really do want transaction prices. Are identifiable discounts and rebates included in the data set? If we're looking at prices, we need those discounts and rebates. Are employee discounts included? And for the CPI, if business sales were to be included in a data set, that's not in scope for CPI, so they would have to get those business sales out of the data. Next, the characteristic level of detail. Do we have enough item characteristics for each item in the alternative data set to analyze those items over time? So many companies have their own unique coding schemes to identify a unique item, and descriptive information is limited to the use in the company. So sometimes we don't understand what the items are in our alternative data. The bottom line here is that it may be difficult for us to figure out how to map the items into our current structures without this significant characteristic detail. Crystal's going to give you an example of UPC codes to illustrate this characteristic detail problem, and then she's going to go on with the rest of the quality dimensions.
Okay. This is an example of characteristic detail. This is data from a secondary source. X-axis is time, Y-axis is sales. The purple line reflects a 19-point ounce box of brownie mix, and you see sales go down over time. The black line represents an 18.3 ounce box of brownie mix. Very specific, but this is unique items to the level that we price this, price in the consumer price index. So this is an example of the 18.3 ounce box of brownie mix replacing the 19.8 ounce box. CPI and PPI follow a matched model methodology. In the matched model world, we track the same unique item, and we have procedures to capture this when somebody walks into the store. This is a case of downsizing, when a manufacturer charges the same price for a smaller size. We treat that as price change. Normally, the UPCs, which I masked on here so you couldn't tell what brand it was, we keep brand confidential as well. But the UPCs change when this kind of thing happens. And so if we're using an alternative data set, it's very easy to miss this type of price change. This one? Okay. Second quality dimension that Bonnie and everybody else mentioned is timeliness. Timeliness for CPI and PPI means getting our indexes out at the published release dates. At the scheduled published release dates. Relating to alternative data, the timing of data procurement. Data procurement is time-consuming. It's constrained by rules and regulations, processes, budget approval, and so you always have to take into account we're producing monthly indexes, and so we've really got to be concerned about the timeliness of alternative data. Data delivery and schedule controls. depending on the use of the data, we might need it monthly. That puts a huge dependence on non-BLS staff to deliver according to our schedule. That's a risky proposition for federal statistical programs. And there's limits on long-term contracts. There are 5-year limits, and then the contracted timing and quality and price, for that matter, aren't guaranteed. Next is reliability. CPI and PPI are reliably disseminated on time and accurately. So every alternative data set that we use has to feed into that reliability. So first, the viability of the data source. Will it exist going forward? What do we do if the cost becomes prohibitive and we're using that data? In addition, the quality of the data. So it's a non-BLS supply of data. We've already mentioned the loss of timing, but what about quality control? What is the level of data cleaning or validating changes? And the last point is data security. We need to make sure that the data is not subject to manipulation, right? Because it's a company supplying a data set and they want the CPI, the PPI to move in a particular way. So we have to be very cautious of that. We need to be mindful of cybersecurity if we're receiving the data electronically, and we have to have a trusted source that's also has the same level of zeal about data security as we do. We can mask. So if we're retrieving data from a source, we can pick a sample that's larger than what we need so that they can't replicate our indexes. More data quality dimensions are coherence and comparability. We must understand how the data was compiled to understand whether it's compatible with our data and if we can use it. So it really depends on the level of documentation that they produce and give us. And when we introduce an alternative data source into production, we have to make sure that it's comparable over time. We can't produce an index 1 month that's meaning one thing and then the next month that means something totally different between both the data sources and between our index and what we were doing and then when we accept data source. Okay, other quality dimensions, accessibility and relevance. So for us, accessibility means the ability of users to obtain our data, including adequate documentation so that they can understand what we're producing. This is at the top level, our published data. We will not introduce alternative data that doesn't allow us to have users have access of the data. But lower level, there could be some concerns. There might be contracts where we are not allowed to share data if it's not with CLS employees. And so there might be things we need to work out, even though outside researchers are sworn BLS employees. There still might be issues that we need to deal with. Relevance is measuring concepts that are meaningful and useful to the data users. Data must fit the intended use. We keep using the words fitness of use. At the top level, we'll produce indexes that are consistent with our measurement objectives. Any changes to the data sources are at a lower level. They will not impact the relevance of our indexes. We'll ensure that. Okay, so a little bit about cost. As you can tell, it's a little bit, right? A key question is, does cost outweigh the benefit to the indexes? Cost includes the cost of data itself, but it also includes an awful lot of aspects that you can't minimize. So cost of IT infrastructure, servers, storage, dedicated machines to run extracts. The cost of processing changes to use the data. So we get data in, that means that we're going to have to modify, test, change, figure out requirements for our BLS systems to be able to use this data, and that could be pretty significant cost. Incorporating data into the existing BLS structure, that would be researching it, matching it. A couple people have said concording the data. It could be really easy, but it can also be very time-consuming. Depends on the level of detail. So that all needs to be taken into account. Purchase process, there's a huge cost to switching vendors. So if we have a contract for 5 years and then the vendor loses that contract, it would be a lot of effort to switch vendors, because we have to change, the data coming in will mean that we have to change our systems, and that could be significant as well. And then even if they don't switch, it could be that the terms change, the costs become more expensive, the data quality becomes worse, or they don't even produce the data anymore. Staff, people have mentioned this as well. Does this new data and new data world require different resources, advanced skills, or statisticians, or data scientists, or programming languages? And then last but not least is the fallback plan. What do we do if an alternative data source falls through or delivers late? We produce a monthly index. What do we do about that? So after all those negatives, benefits of alternative data, it's becoming increasingly more available. It allows for evaluations and improvements. So even if we don't use it for our monthly indexes, even if we don't use it for the price information, we can improve our data collection forms, or we could and have improved to ask different questions in our outlet survey. Another big one is we started doing, for some items, pre-selection in Washington office. So when the economic assistant in the field goes to select a unique item for the CPI to price, we've done a couple of the top-level steps based on secondary source data so that it's more efficient, reduces respondent burden, is more accurate. 3 and 4, it may reduce collection costs, and it definitely reduces respondent burden. And the collection costs include all of the field travel time, collection time, multiple visits, getting cooperation, the data review that's done in the field, commodity analyst or industry analyst, that's the micro-price data review of outliers that is done in Washington office. Definitely increases sample size. And it could increase data quality. As Bonnie talked a lot about different aspects. There's pros and cons, trade-offs involved, but it depends on what problem we're trying to solve. It might be really useful for increasing data quality. And one of the big things might be transaction-level prices instead of list prices. And it may increase timeliness, maybe. This is an example of the sample size of the CPI over about 7 years, our new car sample, and then we bought J.D. Power new car data. I guess I should say new vehicle because it includes trucks. Over a 7-year period, that's the number of observations of J.D. Power. So this is an example of how much better, or sorry, because that's not right. This is an example of how much more data we can get. But, you know, when you get a sample of data, is it probability proportional to size? Is it representative? So this is an example of more, not necessarily better. Okay. So I've mentioned these are our current CPI and PPI quality metrics at the overall index levels. The program also tracks more detailed information to check and make sure we're doing the right thing that isn't released to the public, like substitution rates, response rates at the item level. Alternative data for BLS tends to be analyzed at a much more detailed level. It's more detailed items, and it is we really double check and make sure that we can use it. We want to maintain or improve overall index quality. We're just not going to use it blindly, while being cost effective with government dollars. So we made up this thing called an alternative data matrix. It is a list. Here, I'm going to go to the next screen. The columns are ways that we can use alternative data, and the rows are the quality metrics that we consider. There's lots of considerations given to this data. There's, you could fill it out plus and minus for any data source that you wanted. You could, ideally, we would try to measure some of these things and at least qualitatively analyze how good this data is, always with the goal of improving our indexes, or at least maintaining the quality if it's cost effective. This is the cost benefits that we should worry about, just listed out. And the bottom one is the specific issue or problem we're trying to address. So we inform the public of major methodological changes, either by MLR articles or technical notes. Sometimes we put out an experimental index or historical indexes. That's major methodological change. If we make a change to the way that data is just collected or received, we inform the public as appropriate on a case-by-case basis. So it's a small piece of our index, and we don't always inform the public because BLS does not divulge respondent identifying information. We cannot. If the quality and characteristics of the input data set meet BLS standards, as we've been talking about, and address our needs cost effectively, we will use the alternative data. If the data or characteristics can be cleaned for our use cost effectively, we'll clean the data before use to make it acceptable and use it, or else we won't use it. And we do all this analysis. There's lots of data sets, and we're just constantly doing this analysis as resources allow. All right, last slide. I don't know if I'm on time or not. Airlines for America is the Association for Airlines, and they publish a price index whose methodology and scope is very similar to PPI. That is the pink line. PPI is the green line. PPI gets sample data at virtually no cost from the respondent and very little respondent burden. Airlines for America costs money. So this is an example where we do this analysis and we see that the indexes are right on top, PPI is right on top of Airlines for America, and it's just not cost effective to use this alternative data. And CPI, just for the record, because I'm CPI, it's a different scope. That's why CPI is different. We exclude business travelers. So thank you very much.